Roundtable. And their speaker is going to be Dave Garacki from the West Valley Civil Warriors on the topic of Hunters of Men, Civil War Sharpshooters.
I did want to see that.
That's in September, right?
Yeah.
September 21st at 7 p.m. and that's online. But our sister roundtable out in the Inland Empire, those are the ones who meet at we're meeting at the Lincoln Shrine. They're currently meeting online in place of meeting at the Lincoln Shrine, as I understand it. But they're having a Zoom meeting on Tuesday, September 14th. And to get their Zoom link, you will have to send an email and they will send you the Zoom link.
Zoom?
Email to iecwrt@gmail.com and they will send you back the Zoom link. The speaker in September is going to be Stuart Henderson, who is an interpretive park ranger at both Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania, but he's also a reenactor and an author with the emerging Civil War group. And he'll be speaking about the United States colored troops during the American Civil War. And so that's one that they especially wanted to have a good audience for, and I hope some of you will be able to attend it. And as we mentioned before, places are trying to start opening up again, but the drum barracks is still only open by appointment. So we'll let you know as soon as they open fully, but right now they're just slightly open and they're waiting for the county and city and state rules to relax a bit from the current COVID surge before they open up for full programming. And there's reasonable caution at this point, unfortunately. And for those of you who arrived late, the Pasadena Central Library had some wall examination earlier today, and we're hoping to find out what they found because they were examining one of the walls that has one of these supposedly hollow pillars behind it, and they're trying to find out whether they really are hollow or whether there's something just really weird in them. So we'll know more about that before next meeting. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Janet now to introduce our speaker for this evening because we don't want to keep him up late.
No, or early. Welcome, Dr. Waite. Kevin Waite is an assistant professor of history at Durham University in the UK, and is the author of West of Slavery, The Southern Dream of a Transcontinental Empire. He's currently writing a history of the life and times of Biddy Mason, a Georgia slave turned California real estate entrepreneur. Research for that book is funded by a collaborative research grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a grant he co-directs. The project has created a website on Biddy Mason and her long road to freedom, and he's going to be sharing a little bit more of that information with us after the talk on his book. His writing has appeared in the Atlantic, National Geographic, the Los Angeles Times, HuffPost, Slate, the New Republic, and the Washington Post. And without further ado, welcome Kevin Waite.
Thanks so much, Janet, and thanks for making this happen. Janet's done a really beautiful job with promoting the talk and just pulling it all together. Thanks to you, Nick, too. It's really nice to be here, at least to be in Pasadena virtually. I'm a native of the city, and I really hope to come to future Civil War roundtables in person when it's not 3:15 in the morning my time. I thought I was going to be in the US for this, but that was my bad. Obviously, travel in COVID times is really difficult. It's also great to hear that Owen Brown's grave has been restored. So next time I'm in town, I'm going to make a pilgrimage there as well. So I might be in touch with you. It's Michelle, right?
I've turned off the audio for everybody except for you. So they can respond in the chat, but they can't do the audio right now just to
okay, good.
Sure
we'll pick that up later.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the slides. If you can't see the slides, can you just make a note in the chat? But hopefully
we're seeing your slides.
Okay, great. Thanks. So if you found yourself sitting in, say, a Los Angeles bar room in the spring of 1861, chances are you'd hear a curious little anthem being sung. It was called "We'll Hang Abe Lincoln to a tree. And it really captured the loud, angry spirit of rebellion that was currently brewing in Los Angeles. Over the coming years, Confederate sympathizers in LA would do a lot more than just sing about their anti-union grievances. They staged rallies to celebrate Confederate victories. They stockpiled arms and ammunition for the rebel war effort. They brawled with US soldiers stationed nearby, and hundreds of them enlisted directly or left California to enlist directly in Confederate armies. In fact, Los Angeles furnished the only Confederate militia from a free state, a unit of about 80 men commanded by the former undersheriff of the county. As one of LA's rare unionists lamented, the leading men of the county were for the Jeff Davis government first, last, and all the time. Now, why in the world did Los Angeles, a frontier town in a free state located about 2,500 miles from the heartland of the Confederacy, respond so enthusiastically to what was, in essence, a rebellion over slavery? And that's really the question at the heart of this talk, not because this lecture is about Los Angeles per se, but I think by explaining the Confederate orientation of LA, we really gain a new perspective on the geopolitics of American slavery and the Civil War era writ large. And that's because I argue that Confederate LA wasn't an outlier among places in the Southwest at the time. It was in a lot of ways representative of a pro-slavery and anti-government ethos that really swept across the entire region in the decade before the Civil War. Beginning in the late 1840s, slaveholders began to systematically draw the southwestern quarter of the country into their political orbit. And as I'll argue, they really transformed this entire region, which included New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, and California, into a political client of the plantation states. So for the next half hour or so, I want to explain how they managed to do that and what this Western history can tell us about the coming, the conduct, and even the consequences of the American Civil War. And I want to start with a map, and not just any map, but I think a particularly misleading one. It's probably a map that you've all seen in your high school American history textbooks, right? You get slave states in one color, free states in another color, and then you typically get the Western territories in some sort of like neutral beige. But what I'm trying to argue is that there was nothing neutral about the territories of New Mexico and Utah and what would eventually become Arizona. And that, as a lot of you know, California doesn't deserve its free state blue either. And in fact, it would be far more accurate to color the entire Southwest sort of a pinkish color, which is what I tried to convey on the cover of the book here. Now, to explain how we get this map and why it ultimately matters, I'm going to divide this talk into roughly 3 equal sections. First, I'll explain how slavery infiltrated the American West in the decade before the Civil War. Then we'll move to Secession winter, 1860-1861, to look at how the crisis over disunion reached far beyond the 11 states that would eventually become the Confederacy. And finally, we'll spend some time in the war itself to see how slaveholders' long-standing dreams of Western empire morphed into a full-blown military campaign. And at the end of it all, I hope we'll begin to see the Civil War era from a new perspective. I mean, this history won't be entirely new to a lot of you, but I hope some of the sort of granular detail helps you appreciate how the crisis over slavery could never be quarantined to the eastern half of the country. The Civil War, I argue, was a truly continental crisis of the Union, and it really left marks on the American West that can still be seen to this day. Okay, so how did African-American chattel slavery infiltrate the American West? That story really begins with the California gold rush, as a lot of you know. So among the masses of young men who dashed off to make their fortunes in California beginning in 1849 were thousands of white Southerners. And a number of these white Southerners came west with enslaved African Americans in tow. And they forced their slaves to mine for gold and to basically carry out all the tasks like cooking and cleaning and washing and sewing upon which their gold mining operations depended. Now, some leaders in the South looked at these developments and they envisioned sort of the next great slaveholding enterprise. Henry Wise, the future governor of Virginia, predicted that his state alone stood to make $1 billion, and that's billion with a B, dollars, from the sale of its surplus slave population to California. I mean, his estimate was obviously completely absurd, but Southerners in California did in fact prove over the next several years that they could reap some pretty tidy sums from slave labor in the mines. So according to some reports I found, Black men were sold for as much as $4,000 on the San Francisco slave market, which was about 4 times the price that they would have fetched in the slave states of the South. Now, Southerners typically brought just 1 or 2 enslaved workers at a time with them, though some Southern mining groups did own upwards of a dozen or more. One planter alone shipped about 35 enslaved people to California before he died in a shooting accident about a year later. Now, a precise number is really tough to pin down because of a lot of these forced importations were done clandestinely, but probably somewhere between 500 to 1,500 enslaved Black people were carried into California over the course of the gold rush. And they labored beside countless enslaved Native Americans. Now, the figure of those 500 to 1,500 Black slaves may not sound like a whole lot, but when you consider the expense and the logistical difficulties of forcibly transporting people across thousands of miles of terrain, it's actually, I think, a pretty remarkable and frightening statistic. Keep in mind that at the time, the cost of a prime field hand was about $1,000, which is today roughly the equivalent of $25,000. So to run the risk of bringing an enslaved person onto the California frontier, you'd have to be pretty confident of yielding a high return. Now, this obviously runs counter to what we were all taught in school, right? California, as we know, came into the Union as a free state. It's part of what we know as the Compromise of 1850. With that act, as you know, slavery was formally abolished in California. And this seemingly ends the history of slavery in the American Far West, right? I mean, that's precisely what the South Carolina slaveholder and radical John C. Calhoun famously argued in his very last Senate speech. And that's also, as a lot of you know, what most historians have been arguing ever since. So most of the big important books on the coming of the Civil War, James McPherson, Alan Welso, you name it, really mark the Compromise of 1850 as this real breaking point. After that, California and the Far West just sort of fall out of the narrative. This part of the country is no longer a central player in the drama over slavery and the Civil War, at least according to most books on the Civil War era, which, this is not to knock them. These are the foundational works on the subject in a lot of ways. But according to these sort of master narratives, the Far West is basically an abstraction in debates between Easterners. But what my book argues is that the issue of slavery in the Far West was never abstract or inconsequential. I argue instead that this moment in 1850 was really just the beginning of a new phase in the campaign for slavery's expansion. That California's troubles with slavery had only just begun, and that soon neighboring territories in the Southwest would also get caught up in the thrall of slaveholders. And you just need to look at what happened in Mormon, Utah 2 years later. In 1852, the legislature of Utah resoundingly passed slave code for the territory. Black chattel slavery had actually existed in Utah since the very beginning of the Mormon presence there. In fact, among the very first pioneers to arrive in Utah were 3 enslaved men. Their names are inscribed on the Brigham Young Monument in Central Salt Lake City, which celebrates this founding moment in Mormon history. You may notice, though, that on the base of this monument, the 3 slaves are euphemistically called colored servants. And probably as many as 100 enslaved African Americans were ultimately transported to Utah, where they could be legally held as property. Neighboring New Mexico passed its own slave code in 1859, and it was far more draconian than Utah's law. It gave tremendous latitude to slaveholders in the buying and the selling and the beating of their human property. According to a US senator from Kentucky, quote, "The New Mexico law is as complete on the subject as the law of any state that I know of." By the way, New Mexico and Utah encompass the present-day states of Arizona and Nevada, along with parts of Colorado and Wyoming as well. So these 2 codes meant that slavery was now legal across a huge swath of the American West. And I should add again that African-American slavery in these places in Utah and New Mexico existed alongside the enslavement of American Indians. So as I argue, the American Southwest really was slave country. But the real issue wasn't necessarily the total number of Black slaves that Southerners managed to import into the West. After all, that number was relatively small. Rather, it was the political power upon which these pro-slavery laws rested. In other words, Utah, New Mexico, and California didn't need to become big cotton-producing plantation states for planters to claim them as their own. And California's early political history is really a case in point, as a lot of you will know. Southern slaveholders literally pulled their hair and gnashed their teeth when California came into the Union as a free state in 1850, only to find that their tantrums were completely unwarranted. Through the 1850s, California voted with the slave South on almost all the major issues of the day, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. And basically, whenever the issue of slavery in the Western territories came up, California's lawmakers fell in line with white Southerners. And that's largely because of this guy here, William Gwin. So Gwin was California's ranking senator through most of the 1850s, at the same time that he continued to own and operate by proxy a massive plantation with about 200 Black slaves in Natchez, Mississippi. And in California, Gwin ran this really well-oiled political machine, which maintained a virtual monopoly on all the big federal patronage jobs in the state, which he then packed with all his white Southern friends. So even though white Southerners never really amounted to much more than 30% of the state's total voting population, they won election after election. This was, in other words, minority rule in California. And California's courts reinforced this minority coalition. 5 of the 7 justices who sat on the California Supreme Court between 1852 and 1857 hailed from the slave states, including the notoriously pro-slavery Chief Justice. And one of the 2 northern-born justices was a supporter of John C. Calhoun. And on dozens of occasions, the California Supreme Court and the courts below it ruled in favor of slaveholders and against the freedom claims of the enslaved. In effect, they ensured that California was a free state in name only. And that's why slaveholders continued to import enslaved people after 1850. A letter from one young Kentuckian in California's gold country sums up this logic pretty well. The letter's at the Bancroft Library. and he urged his father to send one of the family slaves to California in the early 1850s, writing, quote, "Once he gets in, I should like to see anyone get him out." Now, anti-slavery activists tried to mobilize against Southern Democrats in the state, but they largely failed. Take, for instance, the short career of David Broderick. Broderick was probably the most outspoken and influential opponent of William Gwynn on all these pro-slavery Southerners within California. Broderick was basically this constant thorn in their side and a very rare voice of anti-slavery conscience in the far West, although I would characterize him as a moderate on the subject rather than, a staunchly anti-slavery. And toward the end of the 1850s, he actually managed to get himself elected to the US Senate, despite the power that the white Southerners in the state wielded. But he only lasted about a year on the job before he was goaded into a duel by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, David Terry. Terry, who was a slaveholder and a former Texas Ranger, actually resigned from his job as Chief Justice just so he could take part in this duel. And during the duel, Broderick's pistol misfired, giving Terry a clean shot at the senator, and that was that. Broderick died of his wounds 3 days later. And supposedly his last words were, quote, "They have killed me because I was opposed to the extension of slavery and a corrupt administration." He was the only US senator to be killed outside a war zone until Huey Long in 1935, and then Bobby Kennedy in 1968. Now, hand in hand with Broderick's death was the absolutely dismal performance of the Republican Party in California. The GOP was actually founded, as a lot of you know, in the 1850s as an explicitly anti-slavery party. And by the late 1850s, these anti-slavery Republicans were surging across the Northeast and the Northwest. But in California, they were absolutely trounced year after year after year. So in the 1856 presidential election, John C. Fremont, who was once a hero, as you know, in California, got just 19% of the state's total vote. Anti-slavery politics were so unpopular in California that in 1857, the California Republican Party nominated an actual slaveholder as their gubernatorial candidate. And as far as I can tell, that's the first and only time that that happened in the history of the 19th century GOP. And he still lost in a landslide, the slaveholder who was originally from North Carolina. So true, Lincoln did end up carrying California in 1860, but he did so with the lowest share of votes that he got in any free state. And only because the Democratic candidates so effectively split the vote within California. Lincoln called this, quote, "the closest political bookkeeping that I know of." He won the state by just about a little more than 600 votes out of nearly 120,000 votes cast. And California's entire congressional delegation, its 2 senators and its 2 congressmen, supported the pro-Southern candidate in that election. So that brings us to Secession winter, and basically to the eve of the Civil War. So when South Carolina passed secession ordinances and broke from the United States in December 1860, it set off this chain reaction of disunion that rippled all the way across the continent. And that's really how we need to think of Confederate secession and the coming of the Civil War, I argue, as this fully continental crisis that reached from Charleston Harbor in one direction to the shores of the Pacific in the other. Now, as you may know, the most dramatic rupture in the West took place in Arizona in the spring of 1861, in March 1861. Unlike today's state, which sits directly to the west of New Mexico, Arizona at the time was actually this much wider stretch of terrain to the south of New Mexico. It was once part of New Mexico territory. And it was populated by this combination of Native Americans, a number of Mexican-born residents, and crucially, a bunch of white migrants from Texas. And once these Texans caught wind of South Carolina's secession, they held 3 separate secessionist conventions of their own in 3 different towns in Arizona. Now, most southern states opted for just a single convention, but Arizona apparently felt like it needed to make its position on the matter triply clear. And in each one of these conventions, the delegates voted overwhelmingly to break from the Union. Again, this was all in March 1861, which means that Arizona seceded before the slave states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So in a very real sense, Arizona found itself sort of on the leading edge of a national rebellion. Now, following Arizona's lead, secessionists began organizing in other parts of the West as well. In California, rebels started recruiting for a Pacific Coast extension to the Confederacy. Hundreds of them mustered in Los Angeles alone, as a lot of you know, I'm sure. Then in San Francisco, a group of rebels approached Albert Sidney Johnston, who was then the commander of the U.S. Department of the Pacific, and they urged him to lead a rebellion from within California. Johnston, however, ultimately refused, and instead he told them, quote, "If you want to fight, go south." Johnston actually followed his own advice, and he returned to the South, where he received a commission as the 2nd highest ranking officer in the Confederacy. Of course, before being wounded at the, mortally wounded, that is, at the Battle of Shiloh. And as a lot of you know, I'm sure, a favorite counterfactual of Civil War buffs is what if Johnston hadn't been killed at Shiloh? But I like another counterfactual even better. What if he took the offer that these California rebels had proposed and actually surrendered the U.S. Department of the Pacific to the Confederacy? In the end, though, Arizona was the only part of the far Southwest that formally seceded from the Union, which I think raises a fair question about really the thesis of my entire book. And that is, if this part of the country was so loyal to the South, why didn't more of it join the Southern war effort? And part of it has to do with Lincoln. In a statement that won't surprise anyone, Lincoln was a really good wartime president, and he understood all too well how fragile the Union was, especially in the far West. So he initiated a sweeping purge of federal officials, about 1,500 of them in total, and he replaced them all with reliable Unionists. And this included firing the Southern-born senator and the Secretary of New Mexico, the exact same guys who oversaw the passage of the territory's slave code. In addition, he replaced basically all the friends of William Gwynn in California's patronage positions. So much harder to lead a rebellion when you no longer hold power there. Now, an equally important factor in arresting rebellion in the far West was, ironically, the position that the region's pro-slavery leaders took. It's what I call wait-and-see separatism. So rather than provoke outright rebellion, they preferred to cheer the Confederacy from a nice, safe distance. Once the Confederacy triumphed, then they would launch a movement for an independent republic on the Pacific coast. At least this was their plan. And at one point or another, every congressman and senator from California went on the record to endorse this plan. It was a common belief at the time, echoed by people like George McClellan and Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, that if the Union fractured, it would probably continue fracturing until there were multiple republics in what was once the United States. So people like William Gwynn wrote to friends in anticipation of this outcome. And if all went according to plan, he hoped to overthrow the US government on the Pacific coast and to establish his own independent empire. And in the summer of 1861, things were actually looking really good for rebels like Gwynn. And that's because the Confederacy's first invasion of the war brought the fight to the far west. It began with this very tiny force of about 250 Texans who slipped across the border into Arizona in July 1861. But then it grew to an occupying force of about 3,000 men, what was called the Confederate Army of New Mexico. By March 1862, this force had actually seized Santa Fe, making it the only Confederate army to ever capture a capital city in Union territory. Now, it's tempting to view this invasion as a sort of quixotic adventure, or sort of errand into the wilderness. The general who led it, Henry Hopkinssibley, was famously inept and underprepared. And he was even drunkenly incapacitated during some key moments in the campaign. So despite getting a pretty good start, his invasion was turned back decisively in the spring of 1862. And by the time his army limped back to Texas, it had suffered an astronomical 30% casualty rate, which was among the highest of any Confederate army during the war. And Sibley himself soon conceded that the region wasn't worth a quarter of the blood or the treasure that his men had sacrificed. And this is why I think historians like Gary Gallagher see the Sibley invasion as a complete sideshow. And to be fair, Gary landed some pretty good punches on some of my earlier writing on this facet of the war. And I think he's completely right to argue that Jefferson Davis was preoccupied with the major military theaters on the eastern half of the country, where the war, as we know, would ultimately be won and lost. But before we completely dismiss the Sibley campaign, I think we sort of need to shift our framework. And I'd argue that we need to view the invasion, not necessarily from the perspective of the high command in Richmond or in Washington, but rather from Los Angeles and Santa Fe. From that perspective, this was actually a pretty major campaign. In fact, the Union and Confederate forces in New Mexico were some of the largest and best equipped armies, if not the largest and best equipped armies that the region had ever seen. And Sibley's force was about 1/10 the size that Confederates commanded at the Battle of Bull Run. So comparatively, it's not that small. And for beleaguered Unionists in the far West, it all fit this alarming pattern. This rebel invasion was effectively the military continuation of a political campaign that had begun more than a decade earlier. And this is why a US soldier stationed in New Mexico wrote to the US Secretary of War in a panic at the approach of these invading Texans, because he knew his history. He knew that slaveholders had been coveting this region for years. According to him, the invasion belonged to a, quote, grand scheme of intercommunication and territorial expansion more vast and complicated than was ever dreamed of by Napoleon Bonaparte in his palmiest days of pride and power. And Sibley's invasion wasn't the only threat to Union control in the far West, as we know. Far from it, in fact. Pro-Confederate activity in Los Angeles had become so alarming that by 1862, Union armies or Union authorities built an extensive military complex to the tune of $1 million, known as Drum Barracks, as we know, just outside the city. And by the way, if you think you're seeing a camel in this photo, that's because you are, and I'm happy to talk about the history of camels in the Q&A after. Anyway, thousands of Union troops and a couple camels passed through Drum Barracks over the course of the war. And one of their duties was to police the rebellious population of Los Angeles. Their commanders understood as well as anyone that the East and West were held together by this very narrow thread. So only through overwhelming military force could the Southern hold on the far West be broken. This was basically one of the lessons from Los Angeles and Santa Fe and elsewhere. So the buildup of troops at Drum Barracks was accompanied by a flurry of actions and policies. The slave codes of Utah and New Mexico were abolished. Laws permitting the virtual enslavement of California Indians were overturned. rebel sympathizing newspapers in the far west were banned and ransacked. Confederate sympathizers, including William Gwynn, were arrested and imprisoned. And a number of them ended up here, not Gwynn himself, some of the first ever prisoners at Alcatraz. And taken together, these strong armed tactics helped quash rebellion in the West and finally broke the powerful Southern influence over the region, or so it seemed. But of course, it wasn't ever that simple. The slave South enjoyed a long, strange afterlife in the far West. And this is how I want to end the lecture, by sort of moving us into the 21st century and examining the long tail to this story. And it's a story probably with resonance for us all, for anybody who's watching this long, contentious battle over Confederate monuments in our public spaces. And in short, it's the story of the lost cause in California. Obviously, California never built anything on, say, the scale of Monument Avenue in Richmond, but it did dedicate far more monuments, memorials, and place names to the Confederacy than any other state outside the South. I've located more than a dozen of them, basically from one end of the state to the other. So there were large stone memorials to the common Confederate soldier in Orange County, in San Diego, in Hollywood, schools and redwood trees named for Robert E. Lee, at least 5 large markers to the Jefferson Davis Highway, as well as a California mountain named after the Confederate president. There was also the town of Confederate Corners, a scenic series of foothills named for the Confederate warship, the CSS Alabama, and the one and only Confederate Veterans Retirement Home outside the former slave states and territories. Now, most of these monuments, as some of you may know, have either been removed or renamed in this recent controversy over Confederate statues. But until then, a lot of them had stood almost unnoticed for nearly a century. And when I tell some Californians about these monuments, they can't quite believe it. I think, you all are probably the exception, but most Californians are really ignorant of this history. And a lot of them, I think, cling to this image of California as a land of cultural progressivism, somehow untouched by anything related to slavery. After all, myths of the American West as this sort of landscape of freedom and rugged individualism are rooted really deep in popular culture, right? And these myths die hard. But as I argue, you don't really have to scratch that far beneath the veneer of this mythology to get a much darker, much more complicated history. And so if you take the long view of Western history, maybe these Confederate California monuments aren't that surprising after all. For much of the 19th century, the South and the West were separated by a pretty thin line. And the fact that Confederate monuments began cropping up in California in the 20th century merely reinforces this fact. Each and every one of them was a testament, albeit a largely overlooked testament, to the enduring hold of the slave South over the far West. And that's the long, curious history that my book attempts to uncover. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and allow people to be able to unmute themselves. If you do have a question that you'd like to be able to use, voice, you can also post the questions into the chat if you have questions there. While we're waiting for people to be able to come in with questions, I do have a question for you myself. When you were talking about prior to the Civil War and that there was a lot of Confederate sympathy, did we really see that as a big issue from the northern states? Because California at that time, it was very small for a population. They had, obviously a huge gold reserve, but it was really, they only had 4 votes in 1860 compared to 35 in New York. They were really just a tiny speck on the map. Was there a concern about the slave kind of the slaveholding or the increase of that type of thing at that time, or is that something that the rest of the country just kind of ignored because they were far away and they didn't matter?
Yeah, that's a really good question, David. And I don't want to overplay California's significance in the coming of the Civil War story. You're right. California had four votes in Congress, 2 senators and 2 representatives. But the crucial thing were those 2 senators. The Senate was really the stronghold of the South. In Congress, the Senate is the reason I think Leonard Richards would argue that the South was that the slave power was able to maintain sort of a guiding hand on American policy in the 1850s. So it was those 2 senators who were through the decade generally sort of aligned with William Gwynn. Some of them were slaveholders, but even those who weren't actually slaveholders typically supported the political agenda of the slave South. It was those senators who were really the difference makers and the cause for concern for a lot of free soil Northerners. This was why the complaints of people like John C. Calhoun pretty quickly died out after the passage of 1850, because Southerners recognized really, really quickly that once William Gwynn sort of got his hooks into politics in California, that the admission of California to the Union was more or less a good thing for their political agenda.
Thank you. There are several comments complimenting you on an excellent presentation. There are also a couple of questions in here, so let me address a couple of those that are coming up in the chat. Question for Kevin. Wasn't the pushback from the other gold miners about Southerners having free labor?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So there's this famous moment at a place called Rose's Bar in Gold Country I think it's in 1849 and not 1850, in which a man named Thomas Jefferson Greene, who brought roughly a dozen slaves into Gold Country, is chased out by white northern miners there. And in the past, historians have looked at this moment and said, oh, this is sort of the genesis of sort of free state California.
Yeah, just turn the sound off. Just push the button in, turn the sound off.
Okay. Sorry about the audio there. I'm actually going to take that individual out just to make sure that we don't have any issues, because we're having some challenges there with that. Hopefully that will clear that up.
Great. And so I'll back up a little bit in case some of that got lost. So when Thomas Jefferson Greene and his, I think more than a dozen slaves were driven out of Gold Country by these white miners, white Northerners, some historians in the past, this is sort of the origin of Free Soil California. But when you look at the reason why these white miners drove these enslaved people from the gold diggings, it's not because they had any real moral aversion to slavery. It was basically a turf war. They didn't want to compete with enslaved people. It's not like they had any great sympathy for Black people who were held in bondage. They just wanted to stake the claims for themselves. And that's largely, so when you look at the anti-slavery sentiments of Californians during the 1850s. Again, it's not a moral crusade. Usually when Californians made a case against slavery, as they did in the state constitutional convention, it was because they didn't want to compete with Black people. And California nearly outlawed the immigration of free Blacks into the state. It was a close run thing, and it was an issue that would come up again and again. And free Blacks were actually outlawed in Oregon by the former California governor around the same time.
Just as a note, I did disable the ability for members to be able to unmute themselves because we were getting some distracting audio in there. So if you do have a question, please just post it into the chat and I'll read it off. There is a couple of other comments on your presentation, including one in here from Joyce asking to please talk about the camels.
Yeah, the camels are a really interesting story. They came to the United States basically as a pet project of Jefferson Davis. So in 1851, Jefferson Davis introduced a bill in the Senate to start importing camels to be used as military transport in the Southwest. And when he introduced this bill, he was basically laughed out of the Senate. If you read the congressional records from this, you have Davis's commentary, and then in brackets, laughter, much laughter. But Davis finally convinced the U.S. Congress to appropriate funds for a U.S. Camel Corps, and over the next several years, he successfully imported roughly 100 camels into the American Southwest. And he said in his public statements, this was these camels were to be used as military transport. But then he wrote privately to friends saying, wouldn't it be great if these camels could be used to drive out native people from places like New Mexico, and then it'll make passage easier for our friends in Texas to move across New Mexico, Arizona, into Southern California, and to bring their slaves with them. So the Camel Corps was sort of, it's a bit, in hindsight, a bit quixotic, but at the time it was part of a pretty serious campaign from Jefferson Davis and his friends to sort of slowly and insidiously introduce more slavery into the Southwest. The camels, the congressional appropriations got cut off by the later part of the decade, but camels continued to be imported by private shippers into the American South. And there was a brief frenzy for camels in the American South during the 1850s. Southerners thought that they could be used as labor on plantations. And so they began importing camels to places like Texas and Georgia to use on their plantations. And they had these wild competitions, camels versus mules, to see who could carry the most cotton and transport goods the best. And camels actually held their own pretty well. But what also happened is they were used as a sort of smokescreen for the importation, the illicit importation of captives from Africa. So camels, a ship carrying camels gave off smells of waste. It required large stores of water. It basically looked a good deal like a slave ship. So you could have camels sort of shipped on from Africa, giving off these telltale signs of a slave ship. But you could say, no, these are just camels. And then you keep all captive Africans in the hold of the ship. And so in this way, we're not quite sure how many captive Africans were shipped aboard ships that contained camels, but not an insignificant number. They were actually primarily transported by a guy named John Machado, who ended up sailing for the Confederacy during the Civil War. He outfitted a ship in Liverpool.
Next question. Next question is from Robert. In certain articles, including one in The Atlantic, you assert that you uncovered more than a dozen attacks attributed to the Klan from 1868 to 1870, as well as a smaller number in Utah and Oregon. What is the evidence that the Reconstruction-era Klan ever stepped foot in California, and were those attacks and what evidence specifically linked them to the Reconstruction KKK?
Great. Thanks for reading that article, Robert. As Robert says, there were upwards of a dozen attacks on mostly Chinese immigrants and their white employers in California in the late 1860s. They were carried out by self-identified Klansmen. And I think it's important not to draw the connection between the Southern Klan and the Western Klan too boldly. There's no evidence that I found that anybody who identified as a member of the KKK in California in the late 1860s had any sort of formal connection to the terror organization in the South. The Reconstruction era Klan was a very sort of diffuse and disorganized organization. And so Californians took the label of the Klan because they knew that the name alone inspired terror. And their agenda in California was to basically drive out Chinese workers for similar reasons to why anti-slavery Northerners, or sort of ostensibly anti-slavery Northerners, drove out Black slaves during the gold rush. They didn't want to compete with non-white labor. So I discovered a number of these attacks on Chinese workers, mostly in Northern California, that were attributed to the KKK. And so what I argue in the book is that this is again evidence that there's this bizarre affinity between the South and the West, and that sort of the flashpoints of the Reconstruction era are reenacted in the West, with uniquely Western features to it. These attacks were carried out not against African Americans, but against Chinese immigrants. But we have to understand sort of Reconstruction again in continental terms, just like we understand the Civil War era. I hope that answers it, Robert.
Janet has the next question. She said, please tell us about your work with Biddy Mason Collaborative, some of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable members who may be helping with this project.
Great. Yeah, and please, anybody who's interested in any aspect of this history, feel very free to email me. I don't know if my email was on the slide, but I can put it in the chat. I'm glad you asked, Janet. On this call, we also have Jackie Broxton, who's the director of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation. And Jackie knows as much as anybody about Biddy Mason and our history. I'll give the Cliff Notes version here. So Biddy was a slave woman who was born in Georgia in 1818 and forcibly transported across the country, first to Mississippi, then to Utah, and then to Southern California. And she labored as a slave in San Bernardino, which was a Mormon colony founded by several slaveholders from 1851 to very early 1856. And she labored there with her 3 daughters and ultimately 11 other African-American slaves. Her owner, Robert Smith, attempted to leave for Texas in late 1855, and he was apprehended and issued a writ of habeas corpus. And he was brought to trial with his 14 enslaved people. In that trial, Biddy and the 13 others won their freedom. And then Biddy ended up teaming up with a former slaveholding Virginia doctor named John S. Griffin. Some of you may know him. She became a nurse and a midwife in his medical practice, and she used the money that she earned as a nurse to start investing in real estate. And slowly but surely, she acquired a number of properties in what's now really downtown LA. And she acquired these properties just as LA's population was beginning to boom. So when she arrived, it was this sort of one-horse frontier town. When she died in 1891, it was starting to look more like a modern metropolis. And she died a very, very wealthy woman, probably the wealthiest Black woman in the American West at the time. She seeded a family fortune that by the turn of the century was estimated at about $300,000. And that's roughly the equivalent of 8.5 million in today's currency. And so Jackie and I and a number of people are working on sort of recovering the Biddy Mason story. It's really, I mean, it's a tricky story to tell because Biddy herself was illiterate. Despite her financial success, she never learned to read and write. And so we don't have any documents in our own hand, aside from a few deeds in her will that are signed with an X. So we're sort of trying to use a lot of records from people around her to reconstruct this incredible story. And Jackie and I were involved in a dispute earlier this summer. Jackie and I weren't in dispute. We were disputing with others. There's the earliest known artistic representation of Biddy is a mural at UC San Francisco. And the university was prepared to either demolish or simply remove the mural. And so Jackie and I wrote this op-ed for the LA Times saying, wait a minute, this is important. And so now there's the fight's ongoing, but it's going to be interesting to see where that mural ultimately ends up. I don't know if I see Laura Boyce and George on the call, but Laura is sort of the spearhead of this movement to save this mural.
Next comment from Gretchen. She thanks you for the presentation and for not using PowerPoint slides. I think she may be a little disappointed to find out the truth about that. The next question on there, though, is one of the maps shows Stanwick Station. Any opinion as to whether Stanwicks or Pikachu Pass represented the farthest west battles of the Civil War?
Yeah, I think Stanwick Station is what historians would call the westernmost battle of the Civil War, pretty close to the California border. And unless I'm getting this wrong, in which case somebody please jump in. But it was a very minor skirmish in which sort of an advance guard of Confederates was pushed back. And I actually don't do much with Stanwicks in the book, partly because there's been a lot of really good attention on the Sibley invasion on the sort of military history of Confederates in New Mexico and Arizona. And I wanted to shift the perspective a little bit from the sort of military side of the story to think more generally about the broader political history behind that invasion. And so, yes, we can say that the invasion failed, but I think we do need to see it as, like I said, this military sequel to a political process that really begins with the movement of Southern slaveholders into gold country and the dispute over the Compromise of 1850. But I think that's right, that Stanwix is the furthest west skirmish of the Civil War.
Okay.
Unless you consider some of the brawls that took place in Los Angeles between Confederate sympathizers and Union authorities. I think what you could argue is the last casualty of the Civil War was actually a Confederate desperado who raided gold shipments up in Northern California during the Civil War, a guy named Poole, and he was put to death, I think, in September 1865 for his involvement in his gold raiding activities. And he himself identified as a Confederate militiaman, and he and others robbed stagecoaches of their gold in order, they said, to fund the Confederate war effort. So if you want to call that Confederate activity, then maybe that's the westernmost battle of the war, and maybe he's the westernmost casualty of the war.
Question from Michelle. Please explain how the slave interest, being outnumbered in California, were able to dominate the California state legislature.
Yeah, Michelle, that's a good question. So like I said, even at their height, white Southerners represented just about 30% of the voting population in the state. And there's actually a really good letter from one of the rare California abolitionists writing to his wife in the mid 1850s. And he's wondering the same thing. How are these white Southerners doing it? We outnumber them. And his theory is that, well, all Northerners are going into business, leaving politics and law to the Southerners. And there might be some truth to that claim. But I think the more convincing answer is, first, white Southerners really mobilized and really weaponized anti-Black racism. Southern Democrats said, we're the only political party that can ensure that white workers in California don't have to compete with Black people. And that was a really potent political claim. And second, I think their success is largely attributable to party discipline and very strict organization. So William Gwynn, as the sort of de facto party boss, packed all of the federal positions in California with his friends. So the San Francisco Customs House, which was probably the most lucrative federal position in the state, was known as the Virginia Poorhouse because of how many Southerners were packed there on these really nice federal sinecures. So even when David Broderick was in the Senate, William Gwynn had the ear of President Buchanan, and he ensured that all his friends got these really nice jobs. So these jobs almost never went to Northerners, and this was a cause of constant complaint from Northerners. But there was nothing they could do because Gwynn and his allies so effectively sort of rigged the patronage system against them.
I have a few more questions that have come in, but I also want to be considerate of your time because I know that it's 4:15 in the morning for you. So are you able to take a few more questions, or would you like to get wrap this up?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on the call as long as people like.
Okay.
The coffee sunk in, so I'm good.
I appreciate that. For those that don't know, that you're actually in Germany today, is that right?
I'm in England. I'm in London.
Oh, in England. Okay.
Yeah.
You're definitely not on this side of the pond, though. Is the challenge that we're facing in there for that. So a couple more questions in here then. Janet actually posted your email address in there for anybody that is interested for further questions after this. A question from George: what happened to the pro-Confederate Senator William Gwynn after the Civil War? Didn't he try to settle in with some of the other Confederates in an enclave in New Mexico? Did the power of the pro-Southern chivalry in the Southern California end and shift to the Republicans after 1865?
Yeah, really good question. So sort of the subject of the last chapter of the book is in part William Gwyn and what happens to him. So during the Civil War, he actually he fled first to the South to look after his plantation, which was seized by Union troops, and then to France, where he convinced Napoleon III to launch an independent colony that he would run in Sonora, Mexico. And the plan in this colony was to bring other sort of disaffected Southerners like him down to Sonora, and to ultimately use this as the base to launch his own campaign for an independent Pacific Republic. And Gwyn is unusually candid on this. So his memoirs are at the Bancroft Library at Berkeley. And he claims in these memoirs to be completely nonpartisan and not at all a Confederate troublemaker. But then on one tipped in leaf in this memoir, he admits very candidly, yes, I tried to launch this colony in Sonora so that I could launch an independent empire. And the plan was to wait until the Confederacy triumphed and then to overthrow Union control in California and link California with Sonora. As we know, this plan never got off the ground. He didn't get the support from the French puppet emperor in Mexico during the Civil War. France actually invaded Mexico and seized control for a brief period. And Gwyn didn't get the support that he needed to maintain control there. So he actually fled back to the United States at the very end of the Civil War. He was captured and he was imprisoned. And he was actually imprisoned for longer than any Confederate high official aside from Jefferson Davis, which I think tells you something about how seriously Union officials took the threat of Gwyn in Sonora. It's a weird episode in the Civil War that often doesn't get told in the main narratives. Then after the Civil War, so during the war, Gwyn was ridiculed in the California press. They called him El Duque de Guino. But then after the war, he returned to California and he sort of had an afterlife. He had a second career. He got his son elected to the state Senate. His son ended up being the lead figure who fought against the passage of the 15th Amendment. So California didn't ratify the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote during the Reconstruction period, largely because William Gwyn's son was such a staunch opponent of it. And Gwyn enjoyed sort of enormous popularity. He settled back in San Francisco, was very wealthy. There was talk of him serving in the cabinet of Andrew Johnson. And he sort of became a political power broker after the war. He never ran for office himself, but he certainly didn't disappear from the scene. And so I take this as evidence that the old chivalry, and chivalry was a term, initially a pejorative term, applied to these pro-slavery Southerners who ran California politics in the 1850s. And Gwyn's success, I think, is an indication that chivalry didn't die. They just sort of had to shift their strategy a little bit.
A question from Irene: did the backlash against the Southern sympathizers after Lincoln assassination affect California Southern sympathizers?
Yeah, that's important, and I think that's absolutely right. After news of Lincoln's assassination reached California, by the way, when John S. Griffin heard about Lincoln's assassination, he was the guy who later employed Biddy. He tried to run into the streets to celebrate, and somebody sort of pulled him back. They said, "Dude, you're going to get killed if you celebrate Lincoln's assassination openly," because Union soldiers and pro-Union citizens were devastated after his assassination, and so they mobbed a number of papers that were regarded as sympathetic to the Confederacy, and they arrested some suspected Confederate sympathizers, including a former slave named Peter Biggs, who was called the Black Democrat, and he was actually arrested after Lincoln's assassination for his Confederate sympathies. He's a really weird counterpoint to Biddy, Peter Biggs, who thought that he could sort of court all the white Southerners in LA by, I think, pretending to be a Confederate, but he apparently pretended in a very convincing manner and got himself arrested.
Last comment or question that we have in the chat is from Anita, saying, I believe Biddy Mason worked for the Banning family in Wilmington and saved the Banning boys from explosion of the Ada Hancock at the LA harbor. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, this is something that I need to learn a lot more about, and I'm sort of looking at Jackie as I'm saying this. I think it was one of Biddy's daughters who ended up serving as a maid in the Banning household, and I'm not sure for how long though. So if you have any additional information on that, that would be really helpful, Anita.
Laura posted a comment. Peter Biggs was courting Southerners as potential customers for his barbershop.
Yeah, and I should add that Laura is writing what will be, I'm sure, the definitive history on John S. Griffin, in addition to spearheading this mural campaign that we're doing.
Okay. There are a couple of other comments thanking you for your presentation. Are there any other questions or any other comments that people would like to make that we can put them into the chat? I'll go ahead and try turning on the audio again if people want to be able to unmute themselves. If we do have issues with the audio, I'll just go ahead and mute everybody back, but I'll allow it for a moment here. Any other comments or questions here? So if there are no other comments or questions in there, I do want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure watching your presentation and understanding a little more. Being a California native, it's always fascinating and interesting to learn something, in particular, some areas of it that I just wasn't aware of. So thank you for that presentation, and thank you for joining us and getting up so early for us this morning.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Those were great questions.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed this. Thank you. And I hope to see you in person at a future roundtable.
Would be good.
Yeah, that would be great.
Is your email is in the chat? I looked, I couldn't find it, but
It is. Yeah, my email's in the chat. I can plug that in there again. You can either email me at this Gmail address or at my Durham address, which is the.
I found it. Kevin A. Waite at Gmail. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go.
Kevin?
Hi, Jackie.
Hi. One thing about Biddy and her daughter and the Banning family, she and one of the daughters, I'm not sure which one it was right now, they were frequent guests at the Banning home because apparently Mrs. Banning had a lot of health challenges. And so they would go down and stay for, 4 weeks, 6 weeks at a time. That's why they were there at the time of the explosion. And they played an integral role in helping the survivors.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jackie. A resident authority.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you joining us here. We will be posting this onto the site for our YouTube channel if you want to be able to watch that later on. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you in person.
Good night.
Thanks for the invitation.
Night.